to say something different. But still, I would say probably 3/4 of the meeting last night was held in English. I guess to reflect the people who were there, I suppose. I suppose. Um, I'm going to switch subjects, but I wanted to point out results of a survey that just were published today in the American press, and they asked they did a survey of the Jewish community in the United States, and they asked, have you been the subject of anti-Semitism in the last year? So 3.5 million people said yes. Now that is, depending on how you want to count the number of Jews in the US, and I would count them at somewhere around 6 million, that would mean more than half of people. And remember, you're not counting children. More than half of adults then would say that they've experienced anti-Semitism. I personally experienced something yesterday. Um, going to the gym every day like I do. I cross Isabella and the Carry, you know, that overpass. So there, when I was there was like 5 or 6 people with Palestinian keffiyehs on, with a huge banner that they hung over Isabella, like facing the traffic on the Carry, so that all the cars coming on the Carry would see this pro-Palestinian poster. And as I'm just coming up to there, I see a cop car, police car show up. 2 policemen get out, a man and a woman. They walk over to the people and they tell them to get lost, to get their banner out of there and to get out of there. And, you know, one of the women started arguing, and the cop said like this, and they picked up their banner and they just left. I don't know how long they were there because I had just got there, but it just goes to show that the police are ready now, maybe that they weren't before, to deal with these types of confrontations. So before I switch subjects, as I said, I want to speak about immigration and migration. I just want to review, since it's a year since the horrible massacre, what were the goals of Hamas in doing this, and did they achieve them? And what were the goals of the Israeli government in fighting against them, and did they achieve them? So I think that's worthwhile to just kind of review and have a look over at these items. And Hamas had many different goals in their attack on Israel, which was a surprise attack, a well-coordinated attack. It was such a surprise that their political leaders who live abroad didn't know that the attack was going to take place. The attack had a primary goal, of course, of causing damage, death to the people who were living in the border kibbutzim. It was to kidnap as many people as possible, especially soldiers, to hold in exchange for prisoners that are held in Israeli prisons. It was to disrupt the ongoing closer relations between the Arab world and Israel, specifically Saudi Arabia and Israel. It was to encourage the rest of the neighborhood to attack Israel itself, especially Palestinians living in Israel itself, Palestinians living in the West Bank of the Jordan River, in the West Bank area, to encourage militants who are sympathetic with Hamas to do the same thing. For example, the Hezbollah in Lebanon. It was also to encourage states like Syria and Jordan and even Egypt to attack Israel if they could, to sort of get rid of Israel once and for all. It was to, of course, increase their reputation and popularity among the Palestinians themselves, especially the Palestinians living outside of Gaza, who were coping with a very unpopular leadership in the name of Mr. Abbas and his Fatah party. So, and then of course it was to focus the world's attention in general on the Palestine problem and to get supporters of the Palestinian cause to speak up, to act up, and to promote the Palestinian cause outside of the Middle East. So that was their goals. When we think about it, you think, how many of these goals did they achieve? A lot. The answer is a lot. They certainly got the rest of the world to acknowledge the Palestinian issue. They got the United Nations to have all kinds of different votes on admitting Palestine as a full member. They got the International Court of Justice to take out cases against Israel for illegal occupation. They got the World Court to charge Mr. Netanyahu and other members with crimes against humanity. So on that score, I would say they did 100 out of 100. They raised the profile of the Palestinian cause all around the world. Countries like Spain, Norway, Ireland recognized the Palestinians as a state and opened up some sort of diplomatic relations. So on that score, I would say 90 out of 100 would be a great score. The relationship between Israel and its Arab neighbors, definitely they put a stop to. There was all kinds of talk about Saudi Arabia recognizing Israel, and that completely was put on ice pending the outcome of this war. The encouraging of other militias to take part simultaneously in a war against Israel, I would say maybe 75% score on that one, because Hezbollah started shooting rockets the day after the October 7th massacre. The Houthis in Yemen have been attacking shipping going into the Red Sea, pretty well disabling Eilat as a port of entry to Israel and discouraging any kind of trade with Israel through the Red Sea. As a byproduct, of course, they also discouraged any kind of trade in the Red Sea, meaning that the Suez Canal is probably down to 25% of its pre-war capacity. They did not get the Palestinians either in the West Bank and certainly not in Israel to create another intifada. There are some few incidents that have taken place, but on that score, I would put the success of Hamas down to about a 10-15%. But on the raising their popularity in the eyes of the people, certainly in the eyes of the Palestinians in the West Bank, I would say they got at least a 50 or 60% score on that one, because polls are showing that if an election were taking place in the West Bank, the Hamas would win the elections. So the 75, well, sorry, not 75, the 33, 50, 55 odd years of Israeli occupation of the West Bank did not win Israel any friends in the West Bank. They didn't say, look, we'll do a better job at increasing and improving your lifestyles than the Jordanians did when they were in charge. That was never a goal of Israel. In fact, the way the current government is operating, the goal is exactly the opposite. It's to make their lives as miserable as possible so that they might want to just leave altogether. And so on that score, Israel did not win sort of the hearts and minds of the people in the West Bank. Now, as far as what the opinion in Gaza is of Hamas, That's not that easy to find out because obviously it's wartime. Hamas has a monopoly on all political communications and everything else like that. Uh, there's good speculation to say that since the war broke out, their popularity has gone down in in um, in Gaza because of all the destruction that was brought upon the Gazan people. As far as getting people out of prison, if you recall, there was a quite a strong um, exchange of prisoners at the beginning. There was this negotiated deal where there would be a ceasefire, and Israel would give up twice as many prisoners as Hamas would give up hostages. And it seemed to suit Hamas for a while until it didn't. But obviously, they ended up freeing many prisoners out of the Palestinian jails in Israel that were holding Palestinians. They didn't quite get to any high-profile prisoners, prisoners like Marwan Barghouti, who would be the future president of Palestine. He's still sitting in jail. And Israel would have released him and still would release him if the Palestinians gave up all the hostages that they are holding. So for whatever tactical reasons, the Palestinians stopped doing this prisoner exchange. I suppose they figured that if they're giving away all their bargaining chips now, what will they have in the future? And maybe the value of these chips will go up. In actual fact, I believe the value of those chips has gone down. So this has become not a good choice for them in this certain sense. But if you look at this whole picture, overall, considering that the Hamas never felt itself responsible for the well-being of the citizens of Gaza and made their lives miserable and ended up killing so many of them and ended up losing so many of their own soldiers. If you ask them, well, knowing what you know now, would you have done this again? The answer for sure would have been yes, for sure, because they see this whole project as a huge success. And how do I know this? Because they could end it tomorrow if they wanted to, and they're not ending it. So therefore, overall then, from their point of view, this has been not a complete success, but a pretty good success. Now let's shift over to Israel. Israel is attacked on October 7th. On October 8th, Israel decides, of course, to hit back. So what are the goals of Israel in hitting back? Obviously, there were two goals, as announced by Mr. Netanyahu, to defeat Hamas and get the hostages back. 1 year later, whole year later, Israel has got back almost no hostages on their own, and Hamas is still alive and kicking. They're not kicking as much as they were before, but they're still alive and kicking. They just shot off some missiles yesterday at Israel from the Gaza Strip. The hope of the government was, look, we know that Israel the day before was in a divided country. It was a country where there was very severe opposition to the government. There were weekly demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people. And the hope of the government was that this fight would unite the country. And so what they counted on was this exact, that the country would unite behind the government in the fight to defeat Hamas and get the hostages back. What they didn't count on was the time it would take to do that job. They severely underestimated Hamas at the very beginning, thinking that they could never mount such an attack. And they severely underestimated Hamas in the whole year following, thinking that, well, in 2 weeks they could, get everything all over and done with. So these were both grave miscalculations. Um, the warnings that Israel gave through its allies, like the US, to its neighbors, don't get involved, you're just going to look for trouble, were partly successful. So, in other words, Syria and Jordan and Egypt did not attack Israel. But the Hezbollah, who have always been looking for, who've rearmed themselves after the 2006 war, always looking for an excuse to hit back against Israel. They decided the day after to, to go in solidarity with Hamas. And they have their own agenda. The agenda of Hezbollah and the agenda of Hamas are not the same thing in any way. But they do overlap in the sense that they both want to attack Israel, and they both, by attacking Israel, build up their own political success, build up their own political support, and also are able to use up the weapons that they've been given, to use all the strategies that they've been planning. You might have seen a picture, I don't know if you did, of tunnels that were discovered by the Israeli military in Lebanon. These tunnels were unbelievably fortified. They were similar to the tunnels that we saw in Gaza, with lighting systems, electrical systems, computer systems, generating systems, undetectable from the surface. So the stockpile of weapons that Hezbollah has is many, many more times bigger than what Hamas has, many more times, because they're in direct contact with Iran. Remember, Hamas is not. So so Hezbollah then is, by jumping into this business, trying to achieve the same thing as there was a small militia in Iraq doing the same thing, another Shiite militia, which also attacked Israel. And the Houthis in Yemen, who have zero to do with Israel, also jumped in to attack Israel. So, Israel is fighting this war on many fronts now. The idea in the minds of Hamas and Hezbollah is the more fronts Israel fights on, the weaker they're going to be on any one front. And so this is just a way of wearing them out, using up their munitions, killing more soldiers. And that's that. So I would say that Israel's success in this war, I say I would give Hamas an overall 75% plus. I would give Israel a 33% plus, because Israel has lost so much in world opinion. They didn't achieve what they're supposed to achieve. They united the enemies around them to attack Israel. And worst of all, the most worst thing is that the divisions in the country that were there before the war are there still, to this very day. So the people who in Israel who want the hostages freed at any cost are fighting those who say the hostages are dead, we don't care about them, let's just try to militarily wipe out Hamas or wipe out Hezbollah and occupy Lebanon if necessary. And it's a government where the military side is not united with the political side, and that's always a danger. The politicians accuse the military of not doing enough. The military accuse the politicians of not listening to them. And so economically, the country is really far down. The international rating services downgraded them again last week. And the state of the economy is quite in bad shape. You have so many people who are mobilized who aren't working. You have so many people who are moved away from the borders who aren't working. You have so much money that the government is spending on weapons and on all kinds of things. I was just reading an article where Israel is buying weapons from Serbia, from Bosnia, places that you wouldn't think are big weapon suppliers. Israel is like scratching the bushes to find more weapons because they've been using up so many, so many arms. Let me just finish this subject by saying the following: that a lot did change in the year. And in terms of things that sort of affect us or that are affecting North America, what's happened is sometimes what always happens, which is that if you have a kind of a revolutionary or radical element that somehow makes the news and gets all kinds of good publicity, it encourages people in that same group to try to press the boundaries even farther. And when they press the boundaries even farther, then they go out of bounds of what the normal population might approve of or might consider. And so if you compare the number of demonstrations in universities and on the streets against Israel at the beginning of this conflict, and you look at it now, they're down by somewhere like 90%. And one of the reasons is because Iran has decided to jump in and attack Israel. How many of these people are going to say, oh, we're for Iran, we love Iran? I mean, isn't Iran the place that, takes women and throws them in jail for not wearing a hijab? Or isn't, because Hezbollah moved in to help Israel, isn't Hezbollah the same group who helped Assad in a civil war to completely destroy his country and defeat his people? Isn't Hezbollah the one who assassinated the prime minister of Lebanon? Isn't Hezbollah the militia which has caused deadlock in Lebanese affairs and in Lebanese parliament so that the country can't pass any laws? So the country didn't have a president for 2 years, a country where the currency has gone down by 95%, a country where 80% of the people are living in poverty. All of this is due to Hezbollah. So, in other words, if the so-called, good people of the left wing say, well, any enemy of Israel is a friend of mine, well, then you look around at who the enemies of Israel, and it's a pretty bad bunch. It's a pretty sad group. I mean, how many of these sort of students are going to say, oh, we love the idea that ships are being attacked, commercial ships are being attacked in the Red Sea. Oh, we love the idea that the Suez Canal is closed. Like, what does that do for them? How does that help them? So in other words, all of these friends of Hamas are showing, in a certain sense, the logic is, well, if these guys are friends of Hamas and these guys are so bad, maybe Hamas is bad too. And therefore, I'm not going to be running out, spending my Saturdays waving a flag. Maybe I'll watch football on TV. You see, that's the kind of way it goes. Anyway, so in a certain sense, you might say that it wasn't Israel's actions which caused this lessening of support of the radical Palestinians in North America and in some of the rest of the world. It's the aggressiveness of the friends of the Palestinians who caused this reaction in a lot of the west of the world. It's not all, of course, like that, but there is this sort of idea of, the more radical you get, then the more people will pull back away from that. So that's the end of this little presentation. Anybody have any comments or questions on this? Yes, sir. Okay, right there. Yeah. First of all, all I would say is that the political pressures that are put on the government from enemies of Israel are very strong in Canada. And the people who are sympathetic to the Palestinians are very strong in the government of Canada. But practically speaking, Canada doesn't sell anything to Israel in the way of arms. Israel sells more weapons to Canada than Canada sells weapons to Israel. So the statement that Canada is not going to supply Israel with weapons of mass destruction, or I don't know how they put it, is all for the headlines. Yeah. Lots of that trans stuff goes on. Lots of it. Lots and lots of that goes on. Nobody is losing sales because of arms embargoes. And of course, the biggest arms embargo is on Russia. And, so many countries are still selling arms to Russia via third parties. So, but in a practical way, Canada doesn't sell Israel anything. Now, when you talk about weapons, the definition of what a weapon is can include things like electronics, computer programming. I mean, all kinds of stuff can end up being classified as a weapon. So obviously, there's lots of trade in software and hardware and all kinds of computer applications and all kinds of technologies having to do with aiming things and seeing things. So you think of weapons as being tanks, shells, and bullets. So Canada doesn't sell any of that to Israel, but when you get to the next stage, there's probably lots of trade in those areas. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I would say that I would say if you want to take, year to year, I will bet you from this October to next October, anti-Semitism will be going down the way they count it. And that's simply because if it has to do with students, they never stay long on the same thing. That other issues just come up and it's the flavor of the month. The Palestinians were the flavor of the month before, and then they're just going to go on to the next flavor of the month, whatever that may be. And like I said, the association of the Palestinians with all kinds of bad guys are not going to pull the students out to say, oh, we support Iran. Let's march in favor of the Iranian government. Let's march in favor of the Houthis. Let's march in favor of Hezbollah. They're not doing that. So by definition, if these guys are friends of Hamas, well, maybe Hamas is not worth supporting so much. Yes, sir, over there. Yeah, right. Yeah. Right, which is incredible. I would add this, that the powers that be, meaning that the police forces and the universities themselves have learned from the tragic consequences of inaction, and have decided to take a much more proactive line in confronting these type of things. So it may be that that also will tend to suppress these type of demonstrations. Um, the not vice president, former President Trump made a speech yesterday. He was at a commemorative memorial in Florida for the October 7th, and he said, well, He said the left is the only ones that are anti-Semitic. And of course, we all know that anti-Semitism knows no bounds, that people on the right are anti-Semitic, people on the left are anti-Semitic, and you know, the Republican Party, who has a candidate for governor who calls himself a black Nazi, can't be excused from being anti-Semitic also. So yes, there are people in U.S. politics on both parties that you could say are anti-Semitic. Not a whole lot overall, but you could certainly say that there are a lot more that are anti-Israel at this point. And this group, as in Canada, is much more centered in the Islamic communities of each country. Whether the Arab communities or the greater Islamic communities, which because of migration, which we could talk about, have been growing in numbers, certainly over the last decade or two, and in some places are a very large part of the population and an important part of the electorate. So like in Michigan, for example, the swing state of Michigan, it's the state with the largest number of Arabs as a percentage of population. And, you know, I think that Vice President Harris is trying to be as careful as she can not to completely alienate these people, which is good politics after all. And Trump, for his part, if you want to see how crazy politics is, under some kind of a semi-hidden organization, put ads in Michigan, and only in Michigan, showing Kamala Harris saying how strong a supporter she is of Israel. And they just played these ads on TV, saying, I love Israel, I will back Israel no matter what. And she said all these things. But why did some organization just choose Michigan to put those ads in? It's because they want to get the Arab voters of Michigan to vote against her or not to vote for her. So that's part of politics. We all know how hard Anthony Housefather fought in the Canadian Parliament to limit Canada's condemnation of Israel. And there's so many Muslim members of Parliament in Canada and Arab members of Parliament in Canada who say, listen, we don't agree with you. And guess what? There's more Muslims in Canada than there are Jews in Canada by a long shot. So, you know, if the goal of a government, of a democratic government, is to listen to its constituencies, well, that one is bigger. Anyone else? Yes, yeah. Such a good question. Such a good question. Well, for one thing, they promised to hold an inquiry once the war is over. We'll see where that inquiry ends up. And maybe it'll be a royal commission. You know, we have royal commissions. They'll call on Great Britain and Canada to provide royal commissions on this subject. I would have to say that fundamentally, the reason is because Israel is such a divided country. It was so divided beforehand, and it's still so very divided. The comparison of Israel and the United States is not, I would say, is a good one. The degree of division in the U.S. now between, you know, the Republicans and the Democrats is as great as the degree of division in Israel between the different sectors of the population. So if one sector of the population says all the others are traitors, which Netanyahu called the left in Israel traitors, then there's no reason really for the country to trust each other. And trust is the whole aspect of this attack. And it's come out now. It was just in yesterday's, well, there was just a feature in yesterday's news about how people were warning the government that Hamas was up to something. And the government just didn't want to listen. They didn't want to listen for two reasons. One is, of course, they didn't want to believe that this could be possible, since the government's policy was to support Hamas. Netanyahu's policy was to support Hamas in Gaza so that Hamas and the Palestinians in the West Bank would never unite with each other to demand a Palestinian state. He was buying off Hamas. He was delivering money to them so that the idea was that if he kept delivering money to them, that they wouldn't attack Israel. So that was, he just couldn't believe that it's possible. That's one thing. The second thing was, of course, that the policy of this government in Israel is to promote, protect, and expand settlements in the West Bank. And to promote, protect, and expand settlements in the West Bank requires not only money, not only people, but it requires the military to be watchful over the settlers themselves and to attack any kind of anti-Jewish movements in the West Bank. And so if all the focus of the government and their military is on the West Bank, there was nobody left there to defend the Gaza Strip. There was nobody there to, okay, the attack happened. But you would assume if the soldiers were there, right, as they should have been, like in 1 hour or 2 hours, they'd be swarming back and kicking all these people back into Gaza. But there were days that passed before that happened. In fact, there were 1,000 Hamas people were killed in Israel. So that tells you how long they were there and how much they were able to do before the military finally showed up. So that's, in short, that's the answer to your question. It was a colossal failure on the government's part. No, it's no, I don't say arrogant. No, I would say that it's a question of making choices, of making decisions and saying, well, where do I put my priority? Where am I going to, where am I going to put my assets, my military assets? Remember, Israel is still a country surrounded by enemies on pretty well all sides. So it has to figure out exactly what the best way is to deploy their forces. Also, Israel does not have a large military. As much as you might think it does, it doesn't. It has a large amount of reserves, people who can come on reserve, on call on reserve, but the actual serving forces are 18 to 24-year-olds who are, commanded by some career officers. So, that's the thing. But to me, the worst of it is that Israel is the top country in military technology, in spyware, in using satellites, in in identifying communications, in doing all this high-tech stuff. And none of this high-tech stuff worked. That, to me, that's the failure. Sure, if they would have had a few hundred more soldiers on the border, they might have, sort of slowed them down. But what happened to all their spies that they had in Gaza? What happened to all the satellites to watch people moving around? What happened to all the communications, eavesdropping that they're so good at? What about monitoring computers and seeing what people are writing on the computers? All of these things that they have didn't work. That was a failure. It wasn't just a kind of a military boots on the ground failure. It was an intelligence failure. Okay, yes, sir, over there. Yeah. 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 Yeah, they were, because the original idea was to sort of attack any border guards and try to take them hostage, to attack that military base and take the soldiers hostage, and that was that. But I don't even know, like, who am I to know? Did Hamas know there was going to be a music festival at that place at that time? Yeah, well, if they knew, well, then that was certainly an objective to get hostages from there. They should have known anyway, for sure. Thing was advertised, in the Israeli press and all. Yeah, well, that's why a lot of the military people resigned, even before the so-called inquiry takes place. um, you know, and Mr. Netanyahu, he says, well, it's all their fault, not my fault for sure. Okay, anybody else? So let me speak about the subject of migration, and it's not completely disconnected to what we just talked about. And I just learned yesterday in reading something that I did not know, which I'm sure many of you don't know also. And that is that, there's something in Europe called the Schengen Agreement. What that means is that anybody who lives in Europe covered by this agreement, which pretty well means all of the European Union, that people in those places are allowed to move from one country to another, to work from one country to another, to visit from one country to another, to live in one country to another, all without a passport. And it's as if the whole territory of the European Union is one country. That was the idea. So who then was supposed to stop migrants from coming into Europe, into this big circle of Europe? The answer is the countries that are on the border of countries that are not in the European Union. So, for example, Greece is on the border of Turkey. Um, uh, you could say Italy is on the border of Africa. You could say Spain is on the border of Africa. You could say that, well, the countries on the border of Russia, like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they're on the border of Russia. Poland is on the border of Belarus. So these are the countries that are supposed to be the watchguards of migration coming into Europe. Because once migrants get into the European Union, even migrants, they're allowed to go wherever they want. You, of course, will recall the Brexit referendum, where the people of Great Britain voted closely, 52 to 48, to get out of the European Union. And the main sort of push on that was because of migrants. It wasn't because they felt that Great Britain was suffering economically under the European Union. It wasn't as if they felt that that Great Britain would be disappearing as a culture and English would be going downhill, or that one day the Europeans would take over Great Britain. It wasn't anything like that. And as much as they might have complained about European Union rules and regulations, and you know, going through 100 different rules before putting cereal in a box, it wasn't to do with that. It was to do with the fear that Great Britain has zero control over people coming into the country from the rest of the European Union. And if migrants could get into the rest of Europe, then they could come into England, or Great Britain, I should say, without, with no one stopping them. And that was the fear. And it was played up by Mr. Farage. It was played up by opponents of uh, opponents of foreigners coming to live in Great Britain. And the places that voted most strongly to get Britain out of the European Union were places in Europe that were in Great Britain that were poor, places in Great Britain that had little contact with the rest of Europe. So, for example, the cities like London voted massively to stay in Europe. Scotland and Glasgow, they voted massively to stay in Europe. The poorer parts of England were the ones who voted most strongly to get out of Europe, because they were saying, well, we're afraid, it's hard enough for us as it is. If we get more people coming in, they're going to take our jobs, this type of thing. Now, all these years later, after this referendum, everyone, not everyone, but we understand now that this was a massive mistake in Great Britain. That today, most people would say this is a mistake. They did surveys to say somewhere around 60% of British people feel it was a mistake, but not that they're going to hold another vote to go back in. That would be too at this point anyway, too divisive. So, and again, and if we look at the results of elections all over Europe, which just happened, there was an election in Brandenburg in Germany, there was an election in Thuringia in Germany, there was an election in Saxony in Germany, there was an election in Austria last week, there was an election in France, the famous one that happened in France over the summer, an election in Holland, there was an election in Sweden. In all of these elections, the parties that were the most anti-migrant came up the most. No matter what other policies they may have had economically, people are just afraid of migrants coming into their country, and specifically Middle Eastern and African migrants. So this isn't just a kind of a feeling of saying, well, we don't want so many Italians coming into Germany. We don't want so many French people moving to Germany. We don't want so many so many Germans moving to Holland. This isn't an inter-European issue. This is an issue of Europe versus the Muslim world and the African world. And I would put emphasis on the Muslim world even more than the African world, because of the associations with terrorism that we were all just talking about before. And of course, millions of Muslims have already moved to Europe and have already settled down in various countries, and have already played a role, both positive and negative, in the lives of their countries. So some of the countries, for example, on the negative side, a lot of the crime, a lot of the petty crime, a lot of the gangs, a lot of the drugs are being purveyed by people of foreign origins, especially Middle Eastern origin. The crisis in housing that we all know about from here, from everywhere else, is needless to say made more severe by more people coming in to the countries and fewer houses being built to accommodate them. The results are that rents go up, house prices go up, and for people in the lower middle class, they're the ones who feel it the most. And they're the ones who vote for the right-wing parties the most. So this crisis of migration then, has so many implications, all around. Now, the thing is, though, that if you look strictly at economic studies, anything good? I don't know. You think I can read my notes? I can't. But what I'm going to say is that if you look strictly at things from an economic point of view, Forget about the culture, the religion, the language, the people dressing up in strange clothes, the people eating cats, for lunch. Forget about all these cultural things. But if you just look at the economics of it, the fact is, in the vast majority of cases, immigration is good for a country. It's good for a country in so many ways. And especially in countries like Europe and East Asia, where the population would be dropping if it wasn't for immigration, where the percentage of young people in the country is getting smaller and smaller. I just saw a survey of China that showed that by 2035, there would be somewhere around 35% of the people over the age of 60. So who's going to be doing the work then? Who's going to be supporting all these people and paying their pensions if there's fewer children being born and more people getting old and retiring? That's the situation even in Canada. We do not have a birth rate that replaces, that comes up to more than 2 children per person, per woman. So immigration is the answer, and it's the easy answer. Another answer might be, well, okay, let's pay people to have children. That doesn't work. It's been tried. It doesn't work. Because people say, you know what, you're going to give me an extra $100 a month or $200 a month, and I have to feed, clothe, house, educate, look after a child, an extra child. How am I going to myself going to go to work as a parent if I have to look after the children? That's why. Childcare is expensive. Yeah, sure. It doesn't work. It's been proved. Bribing, I shouldn't say it doesn't work. I should better say, to be more accurate, it doesn't work well. So there is a small increase in birth rate over the years if there's more support, especially for childcare services, especially for nursery schools, things like that. That's the most. If you had free childcare, as they do here in Quebec, as Quebec tried, and for that very reason, Quebec, does not love immigrants. They want the people to have more children, and our birth rate in Quebec is very low. So the idea of having the $5 a day daycare was an idea to promote population growth from internal sources. And it sort of works. It sort of works. It doesn't make you have 3 children per family, but it does sort of work. Among Western countries, Israel is the only country that has a birth rate of more than 2.1 per woman. The only one. So, and some countries are now below 1 child per woman. Those countries are mostly in East Asia: Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, places like that, where the sort of competition and the desire to get ahead is so strong, and the role of the women in the workforce is so is like the women are so much wanting to get ahead and to improve their fortunes, that they just don't have time and energy to have children. And of course, it all falls on the women to look after these children. So they just don't have them, and there's so many single people, just people not even in a relationship, to have a child. The Singapore government has promoted government-owned dating services to try to get people to at least get together so that they might potentially one day have a kid. I saw some waving hands here. Yeah. Yeah, of the Western world. I said the Western world. not the world in general, but the Western world. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Ah, yes. Yes. If you just picked the secular society, their statistics are similar to Western Europe. Yeah. Yeah. Well, for sure. You know, we have read, we're no surprise. In 2050, they said Israel could be very similar to Iran in having a theocratic government, um, which would be voted in by the massive amount of voters who are now, children who will be turning 18. 1/4 of all Israeli elementary school children of that age are today ultra Orthodox. 1/4. That's those people are now 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. When they turn 18, they're going to be able to vote. And so far, the ultra Orthodox parties have been very, very successful in holding on to their voters. Yeah. So here, in other words, here's my question to you. Are you saying that immigration from the non-Western world is something that would affect women's rights? Oh, I don't think that would be, I think that's a product of a very vivid imagination. I I can't see a government running for election on that program. But look, this whole anti-abortion business is a step in that direction. It's telling women that basically they're not able or shouldn't be deciding on what their own future should be. So that is definitely kind of you could call it a crack in the wall. You could well, but listen, let's put it like this. I mean, women are agents of their own creation. And if they feel that this is wrong, then they have a vote and they should vote. And they are voting. I mean, the shocking part of the election in the US is that the Democrats have over 60% of the women's vote, and they only have 40% of the men's vote. So, it's 60% of the men in the US are prepared to vote for Trump. I find it pretty sad. Anyway, yeah. Well, yeah, but leaving that aside, leaving the electoral college aside, just looking at the raw numbers, but just looking at the raw numbers. I mean, um, without going into the sort of nitty gritty and everything like that. If you just compare the quality of candidates all around the world of people who run for election, uh, you know, it's this idea of a populist, and there's lots of populists who run. There's lots of populists who run. Bolsonaro is a populist. Milei in Argentina is a populist. There are populists who do run, but for somebody who has accumulated so many black marks, objectively speaking, black marks, and the people are willing to forgive all these black marks, to me, that's what's so disheartening, you know. So let me just look. We'll look and we'll, you know what? Let's look at the migration as an election uh, uh, issue in the US. It's become one whereby the Republicans are saying they would close off the border and kick out 11 million illegal migrants in the US. And the fact is that the US is in this particular situation whereby they are a wealthy country, a country where immigration has made the country, has colored the country, where so many millions of immigrants have already come into the country that these immigrants themselves are an attraction, a magnet for other immigrants living outside of the country. So you have this awful combination of having a wealthy, successful country right here and a whole bunch of very poor economically or very poor politically countries close by. And all of these countries that are close by have relatives living in the US. And so it's such a natural magnet for these people to come into the US. And they always have come into the US. It is the politics of the United States that have made this into an issue. It wasn't an issue when President Carter or President Reagan were running for office in the 80s. There were still illegal migrants coming in those days. But, you know, they've chosen to make it an issue. Former President Trump has chosen to pick individuals who've committed crimes who are illegal migrants to say that migration in general is a bad thing for the US. They all seem to agree that legal migration is good, that legal migration is good. Now, you would think if there's so many people coming into who want to come to the US, and if legal migration is good, why not make legal migration much more available? To me, that would be an answer to illegal migration. You just make legal migration much more available. Isn't that, how logical is that? And yet, for whatever reason, they don't do that. And it could well be that the reason for not doing it is because they really don't like migrants altogether, legal or illegal. So therefore you limit the number. I think the waiting list today, you know, to get approved to be a migrant into the US is in the years, not in the months. So, you know, for people who are desperate, they're not going to be able to go pay, I think it's $1,000 to make an application, then go for an interview at a US embassy somewhere far away from where you live, and then wait months and months and years before you get an answer. So, you know, that explains the roadblock over there. Without illegal migration, forget legal, without illegal migration, those 11 million people that live in the US, who are 3% of the population, they contribute a lot to the United States. What do they contribute? Well, they work because they have no means of getting welfare. So that means they have to work to support themselves. Whether they work legally or illegally, they're still doing something for somebody to create wealth. Then, of course, they are also consumers. They go to Walmart and they go to restaurants and they go buy gasoline. So they are adding to the wealth of the country by being consumers. And then, of course, needless to say, when they have children in the US, these children become citizens. And the statistics show that the income of, now let me try and remember this carefully. Too bad I can't see here. But within one generation, the income of people who are of migrant background is higher than people who are native-born Americans. You know, so It's just a fact of the way it is. People who are migrants are especially anxious to succeed and work hard and to do well. And you just have to look at the whole list of Indian migrants in the U.S. who are the head of Google and the head I mean, a million different companies to see how migration is something that is positive in the long run. There are there are minuses in the short run. The statistics do show that if you have a whole lot of unskilled people who come in all at the same time, they depress wages at the lowest level of the economy because there's just more workers coming in competing for the same jobs. And then, of course, there also is that issue of housing. But people who talk about the issue of housing, I think they are trying to oversimplify things. I think they don't understand that, I mean, you've got you know, the housing that is being built, if you notice, are all being built for either wealthy or super wealthy customers. Once you're going to build a condo building, once you're going to put down the foundation, pour the cement, make the structure, how you finish it is a lot, it determines what the price you're going to get of it. So once you're already doing that job, you might as well try to get $1 million for a condo instead of $300,000, even though that structure is exactly the same thing. It's just a question of how much fancy stuff are you going to put in the condo. That determines the price of it. So it's not that these immigrants are not buying those type of houses. The market is made for the developers who want to risk their money to try to make as much as they can. And they know that if they build housing for immigrants, they're not going to be making much money. So they don't build housing for immigrants. So we all know, and probably from your own family backgrounds, immigrant families who come, they could live 2 and 3 families in the same dwelling, you know, so that they can afford to you know, make a go of it. So it's not as if they're all coming and taking away dwellings from other people. That's what I'm trying to say. In that, it's a kind of an oversimplification in that sense. Now, if you don't mind, let me just take a quick look. Take a quick look and see if there's something important that I didn't want to say. Oh yeah. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, if you think of the jobs that they do, the low-end jobs in hospitals, elder care, agriculture, hotels, restaurants, where would these places get staff from, if not from migrants? I mean, even in Quebec, even in this place who doesn't like migrants, the Chamber of Commerce, the business people are telling Premier Legault, we need more migrants. I went up to Mont Laurier a month ago fishing in that area. And in Lac des Écourses, I passed the Petrie Company farms. And you know, Petrie, they supply strawberries and raspberries and blueberries and God knows what else to Costco and to markets all over the place. And Lac des Écourses is a town that probably has no more than 100 people. So, okay, so where are they getting their workers from? They have massive trailer camps there. Massive, like one row after another, after another, after another, after another of trailers sitting on cement blocks. I saw somewhere around 8 to 12 school buses, regular yellow school buses parked beside these trailers. These school buses were there to take the workers to where they're supposed to be going. And these are hundreds of workers. And all of them are migrants, all. I saw a few black guys on bicycles, you know, riding around the neighborhood. So, I mean, obviously, Mr. Petrie would have loved to have hired local people for his work, but there aren't any. Nobody wants to work in that way anymore. And that's just the fact of life. So therefore, migrants, in other words, add to the economy. They don't threaten the economy. They don't threaten to take people's jobs away in general. Um, there are migrants who are on the top end who, in the United States, there's something called an H-1 visa. That means a visa for people who are experts in their field. All these high-tech people, they want to get them coming in from India and from Asia and, to work in the high tech. And then you have the need for people working in the hospitals, people working, looking after your mother and father, people doing a daycare. You know, they just, the need is there. The need is there. So migrants are the only ones to fill it. Um, the, the huge number of migrants that we had in Canada a year ago, over 1 million, added to the GDP. Our economy would have shrunk more had we not had all those migrants. Now, then the amount of GDP per person didn't go up because we just had so many more people coming into the country. But the total economy grew because of all of that. Yeah, I have AT&T, Google, Yahoo, Intel, Uber, SpaceX, eBay, Facebook, Tesla. All those companies are run by immigrants or second generation immigrants. Dollarama, Gildan, Fairfax, Shopify in Canada, same deal. Within one generation, the income is higher. That's right. Yeah, said that. Da, 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 da. Oh yeah, they did a study in Australia about how much rent increases for every 100,000 people that come in. And they found that there is a very small correlation. So there's a 1% increase in rents for every extra 100,000 people coming into the country. That was what they did find. Um, uh, and even in our country here, you don't notice, we're in the pre-election mode getting in Canada. You don't notice the Conservative Party saying, we have to put a wall around Canada and shut the borders, because everybody in Canada understands that immigration is good for the country. Um, but culture is a big thing. The feeling in Europe is Muslims are taking over, praying in the street, uh, different, cultural customs. That makes people more, you know, more feeling more strange. How many of you shop in Costco, Marché Central? How many hands do I see? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So what's that? Bridge Street. No, no, no. Marché Central. I mean, to me, my feeling is I know Canada sent airplanes to take Canadians out of Lebanon. I know that, right? We know that Canadian government sent, but how did they get to Costco so fast? They say, what did they do? Just stop in the parking lot and say, okay, you're here? It is something to, I mean, and I personally, even though I'm Jewish, I don't feel uncomfortable seeing all those Muslims and Arabs in Costco in Marché Central. I say, this is what our country is. So long as they don't have nothing against me and my community, fine. They're here to build the country like everybody else. Yeah. right, right. That's right. Because, right, exactly, exactly. In the long run, yeah. Well, well, you're right about again, as a trend, you are right about that. You are right about that, but climate change, fortunately, happens slower rather than quicker. But just to point out that glorious failed state that we have in our hemisphere called Haiti has 11 million people. 11 million people. Our country has 40 million people. They're more than a quarter. If, as this gentleman said, if we just had, say, open borders and say, you don't need any papers, just show up, half of Haiti would empty out and they'd be here, within a year. Of course, this leads to all kinds of, social issues, cultural issues, every kind of issue, But if we can control the wave, and remember one thing also, I will maybe finish with this, that in the United States and in Canada, every wave of immigrants that came, every one was looked down upon by the rest of the people in the country. Everyone. The Irish in the US, who came in the 1830s and 40s, you have signs in museums saying no Irish wanted, Irish keep out, Irish and dogs not allowed, all those kind of signs. Of course, it happened to our community as well. And the same thing is happening today to the Middle Eastern community and to African communities also. So, we could say, if we could say that experience shows us that waves of immigrants who come are always disliked by the people who are there already. And whether and over a couple of generations, somehow or other, the different groups manage to assimilate to one degree or another, and also to integrate into the general population. There are exceptions. I would say there are some. The most amazing exceptions to me are the Amish in the US and the Hasidim in the US. I mean, these are people, the Amish, who came in the 1600s, before the United States was a country. The governor of Pennsylvania allowed them to come and settle. And they said, look, all we're asking is two things. Let us keep our own traditions and cultures, and we refuse to serve in any military. And otherwise, we'll be peaceful, tax-paying citizens. And Governor Penn said, fine. And they're still there, still doing the same thing, still living the same lifestyle after, 300 years. And the ultra-Orthodox of New York City, the same. I mean, they're surrounded by people who are not like them. They don't assimilate. They just stay in their own way. And, they've managed to keep their own lifestyle alive, despite all the pressures that they face around them. And again, this is a community that has been there now. We're all talking almost 100 years. So 29, 20, 24, now, 80 odd years, something like that. So, but the rest of the people, all the Hispanics who came in, and all the Central Europeans who came in, and I mean, everyone who's come in. I mean, today we're a melting pot. The Canada's a melting pot. The US is a melting pot. That's just how it is. That's our strength, I would say. Anyway, okay. You know what? It's oh my God. Thank you so much. I'm going to stay here. If you want to talk to me, I'm fine. I'm here. I just want to make sure that the technical staff there can close off their stuff and get themselves going. So thank you again. And please tune in next week on Zoom. Please tune in next week on Zoom. I'll be there on Zoom at 2 o'clock.